from Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. If you've not already done so, please silence your cell phone. The Community Foundation for Mississippi has sponsored History is Lunch since 2021, and their support has allowed us to expand and improve the series in important ways. We're happy to have their board of directors and staff with us today. Could we have a round of applause for the good work that they do? Dr. Will Crossley is president of the Piney Woods School and the first alumnus to serve in that capacity, and the chair of the Community Foundation Board. Many of you will remember the excellent History is Lunch Dr. Crossley gave in March of 2016 on Lawrence C. Jones and the Piney Woods School. And I'd like to invite Dr. Crossley to the stage now to say a few words.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. On behalf of all of us at the Community Foundation for Mississippi, bring you greetings. We at the Community Foundation are, at the board level, we're simply a group of people supporting this community, supporting the people of this community. And so it gives us great pleasure to do that. And we do that in numerous ways, but one is by helping to think about the place that our community is. The fact that we are here today is important to that because this is a place that this Community Foundation had the honor of supporting. We had a board meeting today, but in my first year on the Board of Community Foundation, we met at the Department of Archives and History, and at that meeting we decided to support the two museums project at that time. And so you can see the name of Community Foundation for Mississippi over the History Museum as you walk out. And so the place that we're in is a place where this Community Foundation has had the honor of supporting. And then we're able to support programs like this program here today. And so it's been mentioned, we've been supporting this program since 2021, and that again gives us a great pleasure to have done that for so long. And so we support people, we support this place that we call our community, and we support programs like the one that's here today. Finally, we're only able to do that because of funds like the John and Lucy Shackelford Fund. That is what is funding this work that you will hear about today, that you will learn about and see today. And like John and Lucy Shackelford, all of you can start a fund at the Community Foundation. Supporting people, supporting place, supporting programs. John and Lucy Shackelford are continuing to allow that work to go forward because of the fund that we have in their honor. So we want to thank them, and we thank you for having us to come and be able to share with you from the Community Foundation for Mississippi. Thank you.
Don't forget, Solidarity Now, the 1968 Poor People's Campaign exhibit is upstairs. The traveling exhibit explores that pivotal grassroots movement and examines the 6 weeks protest community that formed in Washington, D.C. as part of it. And I hope that you'll come back next week for History is Lunch, when Paul Cartwright and Tricia Nelson will discuss the history of Copiah County on the occasion of its bicentennial and the book that they've produced for it. Today, I'm delighted to welcome author and Columbia University professor Sam Freedman to present Two Roads Out of Mississippi, Fielding Wright, Charles Hamilton, and the 1948 Democratic Convention. Samuel G. Freedman is professor of journalism at Columbia University. He earned his BA in journalism and history from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Freedman was a staff reporter for the New York Times from 1981 through 1987. From 2004 through 2008, he wrote that paper's On Education column. Then from 2006 through 2016, wrote the On Religion column. Freedman is the author of 10 books, which include Small Victories, The Real World of a Teacher, Her Students in Their High School, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, Upon This Rock, The Miracles of a Black Church, the winner of the Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism, and The Inheritance, How Three Families and America Moved from Roosevelt to Reagan and Beyond, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer. Oxford University Press has just published his newest book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. Before I bring Sam on stage, we need to do a quick vote. The IT folks tell me that we've got to choose between having a working PowerPoint or air conditioning. Okay, we're getting the PowerPoint worked on, but I promise we'll have AC either way. Help me welcome Sam Freedman to the stage.
I was doing research it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I know this place well. I know the speaking series firsthand. A year ago, I was doing some of my research for the book over at MDAH, and I asked where I could go to grab lunch. And they said, not only can you get lunch over at the Civil Rights Museum, you can go and hear a lecture on history while you're at it. So that was my introduction to history as lunch, and from that moment on, it was a real hope of mine when this book was completed to be able to come back here and speak here about it. So it's a real thrill for me, and it's also a moment of some obligations that I'd like to make good on. My thanks to Chris Goodwin here on the museum staff for his incredible support and help today. Sean Stalzer and the amazing team at MDAH who just assisted me in all sorts of ways, beginning when it was pandemic times, and I was reluctant to travel. That's why I delayed really to the last minute to come here, but whether it was helping me in person at the 11th hour or fielding requests online, I could not have done what I did without Sean and his team. And I don't know if she's here, but Jan Hillegas, if you're here, raise your hand. Jan Hillegas, when I couldn't get back here to complete some additional research I wanted to do, the book was done, but I wanted to write about the Mississippi portion of it for Smithsonian Magazine. Jan came highly recommended, and I'm so grateful to everything she did. You know, the hardest thing, if you're an author, you're a control freak, almost by nature, and to hand over research to someone else is a great act of trust, and wow, was that trust well placed with Jan, so thank you. I'm sorry? That's okay. I'm going to wander around. I'm definitely, a lower level of production value than the slides I was going to show you, but I'll try to paint the pictures if I can. I hardly need to tell you here at the Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964 and Fannie Lou Hamer and Aaron Henry, who went to Atlantic City in my home state of New Jersey to insist on being seated and to seek the expulsion of the all-white delegation from Mississippi. And that's a justifiable highlight in the civil rights narrative in this country. We know it gave us Fannie Lou Hamer's famous phrase about, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," her heartbreaking testimony, and ultimately, even though the compromise was not popular with civil rights advocates at that time, an agreement to seat 2 delegates from the Freedom Party, whereupon the rest of the delegation left, and even the unseated Mississippi Freedom delegates took the chairs, and as a result of that decision in 1964, it was the end of ever having all white delegations from any state moving forward. So that's something you know, deservedly. But a lot of people don't know, and I certainly didn't, that 16 years before the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's righteous insurgency, there was a parallel and nearly successful effort made on exactly the same lines. The only really significant difference is that this one, with one key exception that I'll talk about later on, involved only white delegates. And in fact, at that point in 1948, there were 1,500 delegates and alternates at the Democratic National Convention, of whom 17 were African American, just 17. And so I'm going to tell the story, and it's a story that's deeply rooted in the history of Mississippi, and that I hope reclaims someone who played a heroic role in civil rights and who is what we would now call an ally, a white person who understood the moral claim that civil rights had on the American conscience and acted on it. And before I even get to, the people I want to talk about, who are primarily Fielding Wright, the then governor of this state, the creator of the Dixiecrat movement, Reverend Charles Granville Hamilton, a liberal minister from Aberdeen who led the insurgency, and George Vaughan, a black civil rights attorney from St. Louis. It would help if I just give you a sense of what was going on in the 1948 convention, because we're all used to now conventions that are so pre-scripted, there's nothing left to the imagination. The whole point of the convention is there should be no drama, there should be no turmoil, but 1948 was totally different. In 1948, when the Democrats got together in Philadelphia, they pretty much accepted the fact that even though a lot of them thought Harry Truman was bound to lose to Thomas Dewey in the fall, he was going to get the nomination. But the real big issue at that convention was what the Democratic Party's stand would be on civil rights. And as great a president as Franklin Roosevelt had been, Franklin Roosevelt had made a devil's bargain with the Southern segregationist wing of the Democratic Party. It was that odd part of the New Deal coalition. So you had organized labor, urban Catholics and Jews, college-educated intellectuals, and then you had the Democratic Party of the Jim Crow South. And FDR made a calculation early on that he could not win election without the electoral votes from the South. He could not get his New Deal programs through Congress without the support of very powerful and long-seated senators and representatives from the South. And so certain New Deal programs were written essentially to exclude African Americans in the South from them. For instance, Social Security didn't include agriculture and domestic labor. That accounted at that time for 90% of employed blacks in the South. Other New Deal programs were administered locally, and so if the state in question operated in a racially unequal way, that program was administered in a racially unequal way. And as a result, the Southern Democrats kept their part of the bargain and turned out to vote for FDR and moved his programs forward in Congress. And you have to say that that is part of the reason we have the New Deal. But particularly when World War II came along, the fundamental immorality of that bargain was apparent. The country, of course, was fighting a global war against fascism, against forms of racial supremacy and religious supremacy. And the black GIs who went to fight for this country that treated them at best as second-class citizens and sometimes barely as human beings at all, came up with a powerful phrase and idea. And it was double V. Yeah, he knows, our Black Barons t-shirt, the double V campaign, which meant double victory. Victory over fascism abroad and victory over Jim Crow at home. And by the way, the Jewish GIs who fought in the hundreds of thousands had the same idea. They didn't have a phrase like double V, but they had the same idea that we're going to fight for this country in which we may not be lynched, but we're subject to all kinds of forms of discrimination in jobs, in housing, in getting into college, etc. And then we're going to come back and leverage our sacrifice. And so the civil rights movement, as we know it now, is inconceivable without World War II. And it's inconceivable without the 1940s. I know a lot of you know this history better, but a lot of people out there think civil rights, as we know it, began with Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954 and Dr. King and Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. But none of that would have happened, and none of the legislation of the 60s would have happened without this little-known, undeservedly obscure movement in the 1940s, which the convention is a key part of. Well, what happened with Double V? Black soldiers came back, and instead of being treated like heroes and given full citizenship, they were subjected to attacks, some of them fatal. The spectacle of a black GI in uniform coming back to his southern town. And by the way, I'm not letting the North off the hook. If you read my book, you'll see that Minneapolis, when Hubert Humphrey was mayor, was as bigoted a city as you could have in this country. Humphrey understood there's down south and up south, and he really acted on that. But for the moment, when these GIs in uniform came back to southern towns, they're being attacked. And there was one particular incident that awakened Harry Truman to the need for civil rights. It was a black sergeant named Isaac Woodard who was pulled off a bus in South Carolina, attacked by the local police chief, and had his eyes gouged out. And Woodard became a national speaker. He took that tragedy, talk about making a way out of no way, right? He took that tragedy and he went around the country giving speeches on the need to move forward on civil rights and particularly desegregate the armed forces. And Harry Truman, who was descended from Confederates, descended from people who owned enslaved African Americans, and had not been inclined to take up civil rights, was very affected by Woodward's assault and Woodward's subsequent speeches. And he began in 1946 and 1947, shockingly, in a good way, to move forward on civil rights. He appointed a presidential commission, which issued a really bold report called To Secure These Rights. He spoke to the NAACP, first time a president had done that, right on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And he began to recommend his program to Congress. Now, as we'll hear a little more later on, when it came time to thinking about running for election in 1948, Truman then began to tiptoe back away from his own program, and he wanted to go with the FDR program of let's leave civil rights ambiguous. Let's have a platform plank that doesn't really say anything and that Southerners can interpret as allowing them to have states' rights, i.e. the rights of states to choose segregation if they wanted it. But the story of Fielding Wright and Charles Hamilton and George Vaughan really begins in the aftermath of Truman's moves towards civil rights, before he's begun to back away from them. And it's right here in Jackson, it's just blocks away at the state capitol. Literally within 2 weeks of Harry Truman's State of the Union address, at which he's talking about civil rights, that Fielding Wright is inaugurated as governor of Mississippi. And just as a little backdrop, if you don't know about him, Fielding Wright didn't see himself as some kind of a wild and woolly redneck. He didn't see himself as akin to Theodore Bilbo or J.E. Rankin. He saw himself as a more refined sort of person. He was the son of plantation country in the Delta and the county sheriff. He played semi-pro baseball. He'd come up, loyal Democrat through the system, and there was no particular inclination, of course he was a segregationist, but that he would be the leader of this national mutiny. But after Truman began to move forward on civil rights, and Fielding Wright is being inaugurated, he chooses that day to fire the shot across the bow of the Democratic Party. I'm just going to go here for a moment so you can hear the exact words he spoke. And this is what he's saying a couple blocks from here, referring to Truman's program. These measures and the proposal of Truman's committee are deliberately aimed to wreck the South and our institutions, but they are far more sinister, for hidden under their misleading titles and guarded phraseology are elements so completely foreign to our American way of thinking and living that they will, if enacted, ultimately destroy this nation and all of its freedoms. Now, I just want to, as a sidelight, to say this was one of many times writing this book when I felt like I was writing current events, when I think of the misuse of these ideas of freedom and liberty and what they're said to portray. But the speech that he gives that day, that Fielding Wright gives that day, is understood very clearly by the headline writers over at the Clarion Ledger. And the next day's edition of the paper has this banner headline: Governor Flay's Party suggests bolt from Democratic Party by South, inaugural address most militant in many years. And the newspaper got it right in the headline, because Fielding Wright then moved steadily forward with this revolt against the Democratic Party. he chooses, no accident here, Abraham Lincoln's birthday as a day to convene a group of supporters from throughout the South, again here in Jackson, and he makes another one of these very audacious speeches, and he's doing this as people are waving Confederate flags and, shouting out rebel yells to support him. And this is what he says on that day in mid-February of 48. I do not want to be driven out of our party without fighting back with all we are worth down to the last ditch. Our moral position is better if we have to fight the party itself in the final showdown. If these efforts fail, and if these so-called civil rights laws, which would deprive us of our rights, are imposed upon us, then we shall have virtually been driven out of the party, and we will have the necessity of protecting ourselves as best we could. So he's already at that point saying, in effect, we're going to leave the party, we're going to take our electoral votes away, you're not going to have the solid South behind you. And when we think about the Dixiecrat Party, if you say it to someone who knows it, they usually think of Strom Thurmond right away, because Strom Thurmond was the presidential candidate. But the reality is that Fielding Wright was the person who was the creator and really the brainstormer of the Dixiecrat movement. Strom Thurmond, at this point, as governor of South Carolina, was still trying to have an image of being a liberal in Southern terms. In fact, he described himself that way, as a good Southern liberal. And he still thought that there'd be a way to compromise with Harry Truman. But ultimately, it's Fielding Wright who recruits Strom Thurmond to the Dixiecrat cause, and it's Fielding Wright who even ghostwrites some of Strom Thurmond's first Dixiecrat speeches. And by the time we get to May of 1948, that's when there's a formal convention of, on May 10th, 48, of what is officially called the States' Rights Democratic Party. And again, working off a script that's really a script from Fielding Wright, not his own script, Strom Thurmond says, "We're here because we have been betrayed in the house of our fathers, and we are determined that those who committed this betrayal shall not go unpunished." I mean, in one respect, Wright was very smart. He was not a good retail politician, as the phrase goes. Fielding Wright understood that it was really Strom Thurmond who was a much better stump speaker, so he was a better Fielding Wright was a better public face for the party. And so by that time, we're in May of 48 now, the convention is just 2 months away, and already it's very apparent that the States' Rights Democratic Party, i.e. the Dixiecrats, are going to go into that convention playing two sides of the street. On the one hand, Fielding Wright is the head of the official Mississippi delegation. He's going to go to the convention. He's going to be in the convention hall. He and his fellow delegates, segregationists all, are going to have votes on every matter, but simultaneously, they're ready to walk out. And their official threat is that if any civil rights language is in the platform, if Harry Truman is nominated, we're going to leave. And it's not an idle threat. They actually have reserved railroad cars. They have a couple of railroad cars in Philadelphia waiting to take them straight to Birmingham for a Dixiecrat Party convention if they have to walk out in Philadelphia. Well, now we come to Wright's antagonist. All right, can we go to the next slide? I will do this. Charles Hamilton, Reverend Charles Granville Hamilton, a Methodist minister at that time with a pulpit in Aberdeen over in the eastern part of the state. And Hamilton is someone who wears multiple hats. He's a clergyman, he's been a local politician who's run for Congress, who's run for lieutenant governor. He's been very much of a Franklin Roosevelt supporter and loves to boast about the fact that he led a Roosevelt parade in Mississippi in 1940. And he's not a native Mississippian. He had grown up in Kentucky. His father was an English immigrant, and I think this is very revealing. Hamilton had gone to college at a small school in Kentucky called Berea College. And Berea College had been founded by abolitionists, and Berea College, even sitting there in Kentucky, had had an integrated student body all along. And so that was a formative part of Charles Hamilton's life. And it's probably an accident of the Methodist Church and the way it would, if you know the Methodists, they move people around every 2 or 3 years, their clergy, that he ended up in Aberdeen. And he was a prolific writer, a prolific sermonizer, also a bit of a, self-promoter. He liked to aggrandize himself, I have to say. In the end of his life, he came up with the exact metric of how he had given something like 8,500 sermons in 560 churches, roughly. And I mean, honestly, what kind of person keeps that tally? But he, from the 1930s on, was getting involved in this proto-civil rights movement and in interfaith work. He's supporting and being involved with the Southern Welfare Council, which is one of the early human rights and civil rights organizations. He's getting involved in work that involves working alongside Jewish people on matters of interfaith interest, which was also part of the cutting edge of civil rights and human rights at that time. But he had still been, up till 1948, hoping that he could operate within the party. And of course, as long as FDR was running for re-election and FDR wouldn't raise the civil rights issue, Hamilton was staying inside that tent. But when Fielding Wright starts to make these declarations about leaving the Democratic Party, Hamilton is there as a member of the Mississippi State Democratic Party for that meeting on Lincoln's birthday. And he tries to raise his hand, and he tries to object and to be heard and to make an argument against leaving the party. And he's completely shouted down, he's completely ignored. And that's when he begins to realize that he's going to have to do something outside the Mississippi Democratic Party. And there are other things, and he runs into so much opposition on this that even his own relatives are telling him, don't try to separate yourself from the party. Give up this idea of opposing Fielding Wright. His father-in-law writes him a letter. His own father-in-law and says, I sincerely hope you have enough sense to accept this repudiation, meaning when they wouldn't even call on him to speak, and keep out of this mess. You are a minister and a teacher and a good one at both, and I would like to see you devote your entire time to both. The people of Mississippi don't want you in their politics. But he wanted to be in Mississippi's politics, and he felt it in a number of ways, and he didn't see himself as being a radical. In fact, he says at one point, I've always been a conservative, not keeping yesterday's garbage, but conserving all that is of value in the past. And he was also affected not only by his dealings with some of the black colleges in the South where he got to know people and where he occasionally spoke, but also his experience in 1948, right after he begins to break away from Fielding Wright's version of the Democratic Party, he makes a trip to Europe, which is in the post-war Reconstruction period, and he obviously is visiting at that time the displaced persons camps where the Jews who had survived the Holocaust were still waiting to be processed to get to the United States or Cuba or Brazil or ultimately Israel, but at that point we're still stuck in what was eerily like another concentration camp. And he writes of that, I saw the plight of Jews in Europe and deplored more than ever the plight of the Negro in America. And so it's with those ideas in mind that Hamilton begins to stealthily assemble his own slate of delegates. He's so concerned about what's going to happen to them if it's known that they're going to oppose Wright's slate and oppose a segregationist plank at the convention, that he doesn't let anyone even know their names. He hides their identities. Later articles let me figure out that there are people who were union organizers from the CIO, the Council of Industrial Organizations, which represented the big industrial unions and later merged with the AFL. There were young idealistic students from Millsaps right here in Jackson. There were some professors involved from other places. There are some longtime Mississippi Democrats who just didn't think it was wise to oppose Harry Truman, even if they weren't particularly committed to civil rights. But none of their identities were known. And then we come to 1948, to the convention. And can we scroll ahead about 50, keep going, I'll tell you where to stop. We're going to come back to these, keep going and going and going. It's about 15 more slides. And we get to this convention, and I've already told you about what is leading into this, about the civil rights. I think it's one or two more. Here, okay, there's Isaac Woodard, by the way, who I spoke about, and there's Harry Truman speaking to the NAACP. One more. Okay, now we get to the convention. So it's the sweltering week in Philadelphia. Okay, we got the AC on in here. Imagine a week of weather like outside, no AC. And big TV lights on inside the convention hall, because it's the first time, 1948, when network TV is covering presidential nominating conventions. And everyone knows that the issue of this convention is civil rights. And you've really got kind of these four movements going on. One is Harry Truman. He doesn't want a civil rights debate at all. He wants a vague plank, and he wants to run the way FDR ran. Secondly, you have the Dixiecrats, led by Fielding Wright, threatening to leave. Third, you have, and you can see the great photo there, the black labor and civil rights leader, A. Philip Randolph, who's been leading a national movement for the last several months, saying black young men should not sign up for the draft or report for duty if called up until Harry Truman desegregates the armed forces. And then you have a group of inside the convention hall liberals led by Hubert Humphrey, and this is a big part of my book, who have decided that even though Truman doesn't want the civil rights plank, even though the southern wing of the party is probably going to walk out, that it's time for the Democratic Party to firmly endorse civil rights, to say explicitly, we're going to desegregate the military, outlaw lynching, have fair employment practices, and by the way, also to extend the guarantees of equal treatment along lines of religion and national origin, too. So this is also something of great interest to Jews and to Catholics and to Japanese Americans as well. That's the whole mood of the convention, and just this enormous turbulence. And into this comes Charles Hamilton. And the way it works as a convention is that everything moves through a set of committees before you get to the floor of the convention. And Charles Hamilton takes his challenge to Fielding Wright's delegation into what's called the Credentials Committee. It's a committee that decides who has proper credentials to be seated on the floor of the convention. And his argument is primarily that Wright's slate has not promised to back Harry Truman, and that puts them outside the tent of the Democratic Party, and they should not be seated on the basis of being disloyal to the party. And in fact, Hamilton called his slates the loyal Democrats of Mississippi. So that's the argument he's making. But he also does go on then to make the argument that the opposition to civil rights that Wright's slate and other Southern slates, Strom Thurmond's slate from South Carolina, are hewing to, and that for them is the deal breaker of all deal breakers in the Democratic platform, that no longer can be accepted either. So he takes that additional step. And there are a couple of other challenges at this convention to all white delegations. Two from South Carolina, I think one from Florida. They all get swatted away. They get defeated by massive amounts in the Credentials Committee. But interestingly, Hamilton makes his case so well and very smartly packages it as disloyalty to the sitting president that when it comes time to vote in the Credential Committee, there's actually a 13-13 tie. Think of this, again, 16 years before Mississippi Freedom and Fannie Lou Hamer and Aaron Henry. The Democratic Party is on the verge of throwing out a segregationist slate of delegates. It's 13-13. And for reasons that I honestly can't tell you exactly, but I suspect have something to do with Harry Truman's people saying, uh-oh, we got a mess here. We better figure out a way out of this. Two of the delegates who had voted in favor of Hamilton's insurgency decide for that moment to go out and get a sandwich or whatever, or go see a Phillies game. They're gone. And two delegates from the South, one from Alabama and one from Mississippi, who had inexplicably been missing from the committee vote, show up. And then it's 15-11, and Wright's slate is confirmed. But Hamilton had been so smart that he had you needed 9 members of the committee to say that you should have the right to present your case to the whole convention. And amazingly, he had thought to do that. And I love this detail. One of those 9 delegates is Hubert Humphrey's father, H.H. H.H. is a delegate from South Dakota. So because of these 9 members of the committee who say, we want a second chance at this issue before the whole convention, there's going to be a chance to give a speech. And at this point, Paul Douglas, senator from Illinois, great liberal, goes up to Hamilton and says, you're not going to make the speech. The speech is going to be given to, and now we can go back to the slide of George Vaughan towards the beginning. George Vaughan. And George Vaughan, African-American civil rights attorney from St. Louis, Missouri, and actually initially, as Hamilton writes, there we go. As Hamilton writes later in his unpublished memoir, he thinks that actually this is an attempt to ensure the defeat of his slate, because he figures at this convention with 17 black delegates among 1,500, you're asking a black man to make the case for my delegation. I'll definitely lose. This is sabotage. What he doesn't realize is that he's actually been given an amazing advocate. George Vaughan, in the months leading up to the Democratic Convention, had taken the case of a black couple who tried to buy a house in a racially covenanted neighborhood of St. Louis and had been denied it because of their race, and he'd brought that case up all the way through the courts until it got to the Supreme Court and had won this landmark decision. The case is called Shelley versus Kramer, in which the Supreme Court said that restrictive covenants are unconstitutional. It's a major breakthrough in civil rights. And so Vaughan is the one who's going to get to make the case. And that night, it's July 13th, in a sweltering, oppressive convention hall, George Vaughan gets up. And as soon as this black man gets up to begin to talk, massive boos come out, catcalls, insults from the Southern delegations to try to shout him down, to try to ensure that just like Charles Hamilton back at the Democratic Party meeting that February, he wouldn't be heard at all. But he goes on ahead. He talks through it all. And he says, among other things, Harry Truman has not advocated a single proposition in his civil rights program but what is contained in the Constitution. And the journalists who were there can feel the hatred and even the imminent violence that's in the hall at that time. You know, one guy for the Philadelphia Inquirer says, an air of violence lurked around a corner and hung over a great hall as the then chair of the convention, Alvin Barkley, is banging his gavel down at the podium and pleading ineffectively for order. But he doesn't bring order. Vaughan just talks through it. And then Vaughan goes on to talk about lynching, mob violence, the poll tax, underemployment, inferior education, public accommodations, the exclusion of blacks in Mississippi from the entire political process, and culminates by saying, as long as they do not participate in government, black men could never have their rights. And that's why this delegation led by Fielding Wright is completely illegitimate. And then things go even more crazy in the hall. You know, people are trying to rush up at the podium to confront Vaughan personally. Barkley is pounding his gavel like he's an auctioneer who can't bring the auction to a close. But what finally happens when the vote is finally taken is that very quickly Barkley does it by a voice vote and says, okay, Wright slate won, end of controversy. But immediately the mayor of Chicago, Ed Kelly, comes running up to the podium and says, I want a roll call. I want to give you the roll call of my delegation. And then from California, New York, a couple of other pro-civil rights states, they make the same demand. And Barkley has to back down. So now there's actually going to be a numerical roll call to see what happened. And in the end, Charles Hamilton and George Vaughan lose, but they lose incredibly narrowly. They would have needed about 580, 590 votes for a majority, but they get 513. And it's astonishing that they come that close to winning. And the way this fits into the larger story of the convention, now we can go to one of the last slides again, sorry to make you scroll forward, is that Hubert Humphrey was watching this vote. And the people who were Humphrey's allies were watching, okay, go back a couple, right there. Were watching this vote because they saw it as a test run for their hope of getting their civil rights plank passed the next night. And particularly with H.H., Hubert's father, giving him a report of what happened that night, they suddenly have hope because Hubert Humphrey is up in a hotel room pulling an all-nighter trying to figure out what his speech is going to say the next day. And after this wild night of turmoil, when George Vaughan almost carries the day for Charles Hamilton's delegation to be seated, H.H. tells Hubert about that. And everyone is stunned. We could actually win. Because up to this point, Hubert Humphrey thinks, I'm on a mission, but it's probably a suicide mission, right? He's 37 years old, just 37. He's only been in elective office for 3 years, and it was mayor of a mid-sized city. Because he lost so many of his college years to going home to help his family during the Depression, he's only 10 years since he got his bachelor's degree. He is a kid. And he's been threatened by Truman's people at the convention. They say, you give that speech, your career is over. They call him a pipsqueak. Truman writes in his diary that Humphrey and his fellow civil rights advocates are crackpots. But the next afternoon, Humphrey gives the famous speech with his line about the Democratic Party needs to walk out of the shadows of states' rights and into the bright sunshine of human rights. And the civil rights plank is adopted. And the Dixiecrats walk out. And Harry Truman has no choice but to run as a civil rights candidate. And 2 weeks later, he desegregates the military and the federal workforce. And when he wins in November, after spending the last weekend of the campaign holding a rally in Harlem, the first major party candidate ever to speak in the capital of Black America, he defeats Thomas Dewey, and an important experiment has been run. The experiment is, can the Democratic Party win without the segregated South? And they do, because even though Strom Thurmond captures 4 states and 39 electoral votes, and here's another, the past is the present, the Dixiecrats wanted to make sure no one got a majority, and the election would end up in the House of Representatives, where the Dixiecrat representatives would hold the balance of power. Sending an election to the House of Representatives, where have I heard that before? And anyway, and the experiment is that you don't need the South to win the election, and that sets the table for everything that Humphrey and LBJ and Martin Luther King are going to accomplish in the mid-60s with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. And none of it would have happened without Charles Hamilton and George Vaughan. And so it's really been a pleasure, particularly in this place, in this fantastic museum, this museum that attests to the fact that there's nothing the matter with looking clearly into one's own history, to share this story with you. And I'm happy to take some questions for the next 14 minutes, and I really appreciate the tech people for working out the glitches. I'm so grateful to have the visuals, because like I say, you don't want me to be the production value. And if anyone has a question, raise your hand, and I think a mic will be brought around.
Who did the Dixiecrats back for president?
I'm sorry?
Who did the Dixiecrats back for president?
The Dixiecrats ran a ticket of Strom Thurmond for president and Fielding Wright for vice president.
My son picked this up at an antique store, and it says states' rights, Thurman and Wright, Democrat.
Yeah, that's quite a souvenir to have.
Well, first, excellent presentation, but the Dixiecrats only took 4 states.
Right.
And did the remaining southern states go for Truman? Or?
The remaining ones did go for Truman. So the Dixiecrats, I think, went, if I remember correctly, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana. I think I have that right. Or maybe, no, South Carolina. Maybe South Carolina and not Georgia. Georgia at that time actually had a fairly liberal governor named Ellis Arnall. So they took those 4 states. The remainder did go to Truman. But as close as everyone was expecting the Dewey-Truman race to be, 39 votes would have looked like enough to keep either of them from winning a majority. Remember, Truman, first of all, was expected to lose going in, and although he was closing the gap based on the opinion polls heading into election, the idea that he and Dewey would pretty much split the rest of the states seemed entirely plausible, and so 4 states could easily have been enough. And in fact, another effect of that convention, and another downstream effect of what Charles Hamilton and George Vaughan did, is that Truman's winning margin came from a surge of black voters. They provided the margin of victory for him in the 3 swing states that gave him the 78 electoral votes that were the difference between him and Dewey. It was California, Michigan, and Ohio, I believe. And you're right that the entire South, and especially the more border areas of the South, didn't go with the Dixiecrats. And then Adlai Stevenson and John F. Kennedy are both in their way pretty timid on civil rights and actually try to make amends with the South. And so much of the South votes Democratic, again in 52, 56, and 60. But in 64, we know what happens. And LBJ is running after having pushed through the Civil Rights Act and after having said in so many words, I've given away the South for the foreseeable future. And we know that that was certainly true because the Dixiecrat mutiny and walkout in 48 is really the beginning of a process that realigns the parties nationally, but particularly in the South. So what had been the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party votes for Nixon or Goldwater in 64, who takes a stand against civil rights legislation, Nixon in 68, running on the Southern strategy, as it's called, Reagan in 80, who starts his campaign controversially, as we know in Philadelphia, Mississippi, near where Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were kidnapped and murdered. And then, of course, after a few Republicans who were more in the party of Lincoln mold, like John McCain and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, Donald Trump. So, and meanwhile, the Democratic Party, following the effects of 48, fashions itself as this party of interracial and interfaith coalitions.
Humphrey, of course, was a leading voice for the so-called compromise in 1964 of seating the 2 non-voting delegates. Have you seen something where he reflects on his role, very different roles in the 2 conventions?
I haven't seen anything, but you're right. Hubert Humphrey, this is LBJ tightening the thumb screws on people. LBJ was supposedly deciding between Hubert Humphrey and Gene McCarthy to be his running mate. And he gave Hubert Humphrey this test. And the test is you have to go to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and tell them that what I'm offering them is 2 seats. We're not going to throw out the entire Mississippi delegation. We're going to give them 2 seats. And in doing that, Humphrey has to confront one of his closest allies over the years, who's a civil rights lawyer named Joe Rao. And Joe Rao was the lawyer for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And this created a permanent rupture between Rao and Humphrey. And it looked, of course, like Humphrey was betraying his principles. And I can understand that in the time. I think in the fullness of time, when you realize that even seating those 2 delegates led to the rest of the segregated delegation leaving and led to the Democratic Party reforms that were the end of all white delegations. In that longer view, the compromise doesn't look that bad. In fact, it looks like a smart strategic or tactical move. But at the moment, there's no question that it looked like Humphrey was backpedaling from what had been his own his own stances. And of course, then he gets to be vice president, and then he makes a much more calamitous judgment, which is to support the Vietnam War. And really, it's that reason that if people remember him now, he's remembered critically and caustically. Although I have to say that part of the reason I wanted to write this book, besides feeling like the 1940s civil rights movement needed a book that really focused on it, was I kept wondering, why can we hold 2 thoughts about LBJ together? Why do we understand now, thanks to Robert Caro's books and Robert Dallek and Nick Kotz and, Robert Schenkman's play All the Way with Bryan Cranston playing LBJ. Why can we understand that LBJ made a horrific mistake on Vietnam, which cost untold lives here and in Vietnam, but he was the most courageous president in memory on his domestic agenda? And we can see that there's a tension, but they're both part of the same man. And why is it that Humphrey is remembered for Vietnam, for losing to Nixon, and especially for running this really feckless campaign against George McGovern for the Democratic nomination in '72? We remember him getting the '68 nomination amid the police riot in Chicago. All that should be remembered. That's part of the full man. You don't airbrush that. But what about this other part? Why has that been so utterly lost to collective memory? And I think that's something I was trying to address with the book. And also, hey, one of the great things is you get to lift up people like George Vaughan or Charles Granville Hamilton, who, unless you have a Jan Hilligus, to help you, these people are really lost to the historical record. There's very, very little that you can find without actually digging in to the paper trail right here at MDAH.
Can you tell us any more about what happened to Charles Hamilton and George Vaughan?
George Vaughan unfortunately died very soon thereafter. I think by the early 1950s he had died, and it remains his greatest contribution in history that he won the case against the restrictive covenants. Hamilton remained an active minister and public figure and very supportive of the Civil Rights Act. In fact, I found an essay he wrote that I think was unpublished, or maybe was the basis for a sermon, talking about the '64 convention and being so furious about the segregated delegation that was trying to fight against the Mississippi Freedom Party, and saying, I've been trying to tell people Mississippi isn't all of what they think it is. It's not just burning churches. But when this happens, I have no leg to stand on. And I believe so. I believe he did most of his ministerial career in Aberdeen. And he was corresponding, actually, at many times with Hubert Humphrey. There's an exchange of letters I saw during the Little Rock school integration crisis of him and Humphrey. And I found stuff of him talking to ministers in Boston in the late 1950s about the importance of making civil rights advocacy part of your ministry. But as I said, there was also this other kind of egomaniacal, frankly, part of him that he wrote this whole, unpublished memoir. He refers to himself as the man who elected Truman. Okay, that's a little bit of overinterpreting. And like I said, who keeps tabs on the exact number of sermons when you're getting into the 8500s? But I think that that's forgivable because history judges us. And at the moment when it would have been very easy to take a complacent stand and go along with the status quo, and there's certainly going to be no rewards, as we know even from his father-in-law, for standing up for civil rights, he did it. So what's a little egomania compared to that?
I'm interested in the, this is a fascinating story, but how it may have found its way into popular culture. Was there any evidence in the papers, in anything, and how the key actors were portrayed? How did this find its way into the popular culture?
That's a great question. I think one reason this episode is not nearly as well known as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is that it didn't get nearly the coverage. And that's not just because TV was in its infancy in '48 and was completely dominating the media landscape in '64, because 60 million people were listening to this convention on the radio. So radio followed it. But what I have found most revealing is that except for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which was George Vaughan's hometown paper, and except for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where the convention was being held, and except for papers in Mississippi, which were very critical of what Hamilton was doing, the mostly white media didn't cover this element of the convention really hardly at all. But on the other hand, black newspapers covered it very closely. They understood what was significant about this challenge to voting rights delegation. So you can look in the Baltimore Afro-American and the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, the great black newspapers of that time, all with big national circulations, and they were covering it chapter and verse.
Yes, yes, I want to connect some dots. The black GIs, AFL-CIO, and you did mention the FEPC, Fair Employment Practices.
Yes.
Could you tie all that in?
Sure.
Possible.
Well, fair employment practices was one of the huge civil rights issues of the 1940s. And the great A. Philip Randolph, who I mentioned before, the first March on Washington was supposed to happen in either 40 or 41, and it was going to be a mass march led by Randolph to insist that Franklin Roosevelt desegregate defense plans. And finally, FDR capitulated on it, and defense plants were allowed to be integrated. And by the way, there were still a number of vicious vigilante attacks to black defense workers in places like Beaumont and Mobile and Detroit, so it wasn't a perfect solution. But then the issue was, when the war is over, are we going to make fair employment a permanent part of federal law or not? And Truman was in favor of it. Liberal Democrats were in favor of it. Conservatives from outside the South and the Democrats from within the South were, of course, diehard against it. And so that was another issue that was right at the center, along with desegregating the military. And the AFL and CIO had really had two very different histories, actually, on racial issues. The AFL, which was craft unions and building trades unions, was actually very, very racist in its own practices for decades. In Minneapolis, which was a big organized labor town, which I know well from my book, blacks couldn't get into any AFL unions. The only unions they could be in were all black unions for hotel workers, for instance. The CIO, which included people like Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, and had big industrial unions like the steel workers and the auto workers, the machinists, they were very pro-desegregation, and they're very interested, in fact, in coming to the South and organizing multiracial unions. It was called Operation Dixie, their effort to organize in the South. So when the AFL and CIO merged, then definitely it was part of union orthodoxy to be in favor of fair employment practices. But it never got put through. It was fought successfully by conservatives and segregationists, really, until the mid-1960s. So when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is finally enacted and implemented in the mid-60s, that is doing on a federal level something that Hubert Humphrey did in Minneapolis at the municipal level 20 years earlier. It took 20 years to get from what Humphrey and some other cities and states around the country were doing municipally and statewide to being able to make it politically palatable and politically passable for the country as a whole. So I hope that, thank you. And did I hear you right that you came from Dallas? All right, my respect.
Thank you all for being here today. Thanks to the Community Foundation Board and staff. Remember the exhibit upstairs. I hope that we'll see you back here next week for History's Lunch and the history of Copiah County. We have copies of Sam's excellent book, Into the Bright Sunshine, for sale over here. I hope that you'll come and ask any questions that we didn't have time to get to while he is signing copies. Help me thank Sam for this fabulous program today.